Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo Slayback. Today we're joined by our friend Michael Anton, who is a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute and a lecturer at Hillsdale College. He served on the National Security Council in the administrations of two presidents, Donald J. Trump and George W. Bush, and spent the interim 12 years in the private sector in various roles in finance and media. He writes regularly for the Claremont Review of Books, and his latest book, The Stakes: America at the Point of No Return, examines how the present American regime actually functions, argues that a Trumpist realignment could extend its life, and should that effort fail, speculates on the shape of things to come, which is the subject of our podcast today. So thanks for joining us, Michael.
Sure.
Before we begin our interview, we'd like to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission is educating for liberty. If you'd like to help us in fulfilling this mission, be sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So we'll start there with how this new book, The Stakes, is in some ways a reconsideration.
It's not that new. I mean, it came out in September of 2020.
Well,
so
it's your latest, right?
It's my latest. Yeah. I guess I'm bad if I haven't written another one. But I have plans, so I'll get another one done sooner or later.
Okay. Well, in some ways, just the reconsideration or development of your famous essay, which perhaps a lot of our listeners are familiar with, the Flight 93 election. Now that we have lived in a Trump era and he has been at least temporarily sidelined, where do you see where we are now? How do you think the stakes and some of its predictions or suggestions have stacked up against reality? And perhaps you have more considerations.
I hate that question because now I have to say they all came true, and it makes me sound, I don't know, megalomaniacal or self-proud or whatever. But if somebody wants to point out a way in which something I predicted did not come true, feel free. And if I think you're right, I will concede the point. I did hope, if not believe, that he would win re-election in 2020. As I've often said, I take no position on what actually happened in 2020. That is, maybe it was stolen, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. I don't know. I don't think we have enough information. Mm-hmm. I don't think we'll ever get enough information. Mm-hmm. At a minimum, I believe Mollie Hemingway's thesis that it was, even if you don't think any votes were literally stolen or machines rigged, it was pre-rigged in such a way as to make it all but impossible for him to win in 2020. And at any rate, one thing I can say with certainty is he did not take the oath a second time on January 20th, 2021, and he is not right now the president. So it's a tricky thing to talk about because people always get mad at you. You're an election denier, sure. And then your friends who have looked into it are like, you're endorsing their lies. It's like, you know what? I don't have enough information either way.
Sure. And perhaps going back to the seminal Flight 93 election, for people who aren't familiar, I suspect some of our students, just from chatting with them today, we're at our honors conference currently, may not be familiar with it. Could you give us a summary of what It
was an article from September of 2016 that just said, vote for this guy. I know the Republican Party is divided and many of you have misgivings, but we have to do this. First of all, he has the right prescription for the country: a border wall, immigration enforcement, renegotiate trade deals, get out of bad trade deals, don't sign any new trade deals, much more foreign policy restraint, end forever war, and so on. I said that was a good program, but even if it were a half bad program, what we knew from the other side is what they want to do and what they're doing now, a completely open border. Biden, I guess, did get us out of Afghanistan, but in almost every other way, the leftist program that I was worried about in 2016 is being implemented at warp speed today. So there's another one where I would have liked to have been wrong, but alas, I don't think I was.
So pivoting to, I actually think I read The Stakes for the Claremont Publius Fellowship 2 years ago. So, and I believe that's the book. I also read the Flight 93 election, but it opens with California as a model of rule for the whole country, yes. For the left. So yes. Me and Tom actually were both recently there for the Publius Fellowship, and we were both struck by how beautiful it was, because it's always described on the right as this post-political one-party progressive hellscape. And perhaps there are places you could go in, like Los Angeles, for instance, where you see that. Yes. But as you described in the book itself, like, you grew up here, and it's just, like, it could be this, it's this beautiful, aesthetically utopia. But what is the state of California that should make us so afraid where we're
First of all, it's getting easier and easier to find the hellscapes. Remember, you guys did the Publius program in Orange County, California, Newport Beach, Irvine.
Sure.
That's about the last part of California that's going to come apart when it eventually all does come apart. So I just came from California yesterday. In fact, I was staying with my parents in coastal Northern California. I also went and visited Berkeley on Sunday, Monday, which I hadn't seen in a while. Berkeley actually, surprisingly, which has always been a scruffy place, looks better than San Francisco physically. It doesn't look great. It's still Berkeley. It's like, it doesn't clean up well, and the residents don't really want a clean, sparkly Berkeley. They're against that. But even there are places where you can kind of walk around and do your thing, right, without tripping over needles and so on and so forth, as will happen to you in vast parts of San Francisco and Los Angeles. And other places. It's still just a model of dysfunction, of extremely high cost, lousy services, the unbelievable housing costs and you get very little, crumbling infrastructure, ridiculous programs like the famous, Train to Nowhere and this rotting hulk in the Central Valley that, they've already spent billions on and will never be finished. The brand new Bay Bridge span, I don't know, it's brand new now, but the Bay Bridge has in San Francisco has two spans, and the eastern one was damaged in an earthquake in 1989. It took them, 30 years to fix it, and when they finally did, they went to the lowest bidder with Chinese steel. The steel's already rotting, and so this thing has problems. Like, these things are just kind of endemic around the state. It's a weird combination of, you kind of don't get much for your money, and it's really expensive. It's like when you go to a hotel and you spend a lot of money in a hotel, you're expecting like the room is going to be beautiful, the service is going to be great, the lobby will be expected. You know why you're spending the money, but you spend $1.5 million, $2.5, $3.5 million for a little 1,700 square foot place in some parts of California. You have to ask yourself, what the hell am I getting for this? And it's not even like the salaries necessarily line up with the real estate costs, whether that's to rent or to buy. So there's something kind of fake and strung together about its economy that I don't think any of us have figured out there. Like, you get a job in Silicon Valley, okay, yeah, it pays a little bit better than a job, I assume, in Des Moines or wherever, but not enough to cover the vast costs. And that's before we get to other issues like schools and crime and making shoplifting legal by a ballot initiative a few years ago, or shoplifting under $950, which is why you just see routine theft in stores of these cities all over the state, and retailers have had to close stores because they say there's rampant theft and the police don't do anything. And these horrible district attorneys that are proliferating throughout the major counties in California that just don't want to prosecute crime. People try to look at, they try to find white pills. Well, like Chiza Bowden, maybe the worst DA in the country of San Francisco County, got recalled, but he's then replaced by an appointee of the mayor who's just as left-wing as he is. And she's not really any better. She's maybe marginally better, but all kinds of things are still being dismissed without filing any kind of charges. And crime is out of control in a lot of these areas. So yeah, California can coast for a while. I don't know for how long, because there's so much money there. Less now in the entertainment industry than in the tech industry. But I can't, I just don't see how it goes on forever.
Yeah, I remember reading, I think it was Victor Davis Hansen's, it was the book that won the Conservative Book of the Year award last year,
Dying Citizen.
Yeah, and he, I think something he spends quite some time on is the class disparity. And how would you describe perhaps maybe California and specifically San Francisco, where there is this perpetual underclass of people, and you have these tech, 25-year-olds working as software developers or whatever, and living on Nob Hill.
San Francisco is coming apart. It reimagined itself as, after being for a long time very distinct from Silicon Valley and much more of a kind of mini Manhattan, Western capital of banking and finance and publishing and media and advertising and things like that, and some light manufacturing in the port. When it lost all of those things, or it lost them relative to other cities, the tech people started to kind of recolonize it and say, well, why don't we, it's cooler up there. It's it's just more fun. Why don't we open our business there? And there was also a lot of reverse commuting where people would live in the city and then they would, Google famously offered these buses that would take you down to Mountain View if you lived somewhere in the city. COVID and the crime wave have hit San Francisco incredibly hard. It's probably got the worst downtown in America right now. Aside from places that have been dead for decades, like Detroit. The places that were kind of alive to an extent before COVID, San Francisco has come back the least. And people are using phrases like doom loop to describe it. So there's not much going on there. And now there's a really weird disconnect. So I have to go through Silicon Valley all the time, if for nothing else, just to get to the airport. But I sometimes go to restaurants or see people there, go to Stanford, and it still looks fine, right? If that's all you see of California is, let's say, Palo Alto, you'll think, why do these people talk like this? This is great here. The weather's wonderful. Everything's clean. It's nice and right. But San Francisco has kind of re-disconnected itself, and everybody who the tech colony that used to work there is either gone remote and moved out of state, or if they could afford it, rolled back down into the peninsula. That's what Californians call the part of the it's really all the peninsula. I'm spurging out here, but the part of the peninsula south of the city is called the peninsula for some reason. Anyway, so I don't see a bright future for San Francisco, at least not in the near term, in part because the writing on the wall is so obvious that citizens and politicians who had any sense and were in any way responsive to pressure and comment, they would have changed course by now. But the progressive activists and the people and the elected officials are just dug in completely on this hyper-progressive trajectory that I think is only going to make everything worse. And I don't know when, it's hard to imagine the sort of reaction in San Francisco. Let's see, in '93, when the mayor was Art Agnos, who was elected in '89, a really dopey liberal, and he let the crime get out of control, and he let the giant homeless camp engulf Civic Center Plaza in front of City Hall. And the San Franciscans got fed up, and they elected the police chief, and he kind of cleaned up the town. And then they had 2 terms of Willie Brown, who was an old-fashioned kind of, I don't want to open us up to a libel suit, but let's say shady machine politician, but not very ideological, and who ran, a competent mayoral administration. But since then, like the demographics of those people who voted that way have left, or they've been more radicalized. And now it's not just Democratic dominance or progressive dominance. It's like the hyper left progressive dominance. The most extreme, whatever the most extreme position is, like the city should be supplying you fentanyl. That's the position that they take.
I remember reporting on, I think it was for the Daily Caller, I reported extensively on school boards that were being, they were facing heat from local parents, especially Asian parents.
Yeah.
Is that something that has...
That was another white pill. I forgot how long ago it was. Maybe 18 months or so ago, 3 members of the San Francisco School Board were recalled. But, I haven't paid attention to who they were replaced by. This is another aspect of the doom loop. I mean, the San Francisco City public schools have been in decline for decades for 2 reasons. One is the city just doesn't have families anymore. I mean, you just don't live there if you have a family. It's too expensive, too hard. And so the people who actually want to have 1, 2, 3 kids, they get out and they go to Marin, or they go down to the Peninsula or the East Bay or something, right? So, and it just becomes more and more populated with singles. And then or maybe couples who have like maybe 1 child when they're in their, late 30s. But the idea of the old, at least 2.5 kids, that model is dead in San Francisco. And then if you do have a kid there, the schools got so bad so long ago. When I was very young, I didn't grow up in San Francisco, I grew up nearby. Despite being a rich place, it didn't have a lot of private schools, infrastructure. It had a couple of big Catholic schools that were long established for the Catholic families there, like Convent of the Sacred Heart, where Dianne Feinstein went, and Bellarmine down in San Jose, and there were 1 or 2 others. But now it's got this big network of private schools that these rich people who live there have had to build because they can't trust the public system anymore. Sure. And that just has further drained kids out. And the other thing, too, that they had, like a lot of big cities in the country, like Boston and New York, they had a competitive entry public high school that, because it's competitive entry, you get in based on basically grades, but mostly test scores. Mm-hmm. In a city that's had a Chinatown going back to 1850, this school ends up being dominated by Asians, and then it gets the diversity pressure on it. Well, why isn't this represent the demographics of the city and so on? So they had to gut the entrance requirements. And once, if you live in San Francisco and your kid's really smart, you think, well, one way I can save money is maybe he'll get into Lowell. Well, now, maybe he won't get in, or she won't get into Lowell because of the new admissions procedures, which, by the way, we're seeing throughout education nationally, not just at these high schools, but at colleges too, including the University of California right across the bay. I think, I try to keep up on this, that one of the famous ones, maybe the most famous one in the country, Stuyvesant High in New York, is one of the last holdouts, in part because it has a lot of alumni who were like lower middle class kids who went through it, and they went on to make it big, and they said, look, I never would have made it out of whatever I came from in the Bronx if it weren't for this place, and we have to keep it the same. And I don't even care what the demographic is, as long as we know that these are smart kids that are going to do something with themselves. But the pressure on Stuyvesant, similar demographic thing, it's like 70% Asian, something like that, is overwhelming. And I bet in New York, it just gets more and more progressive in the same way. I bet eventually it'll crack and they'll have to they'll have to change the standards and make it a lottery entry, or I don't know, who knows what kind of system they'll come up with. But it will be not what they have had for the last 100 years.
Yeah, I saw it circulating on Twitter, a screenshot of how I think it's John Hopkins is trying to work around the affirmative action decision and asking write a 300-word piece about how race or religion or sex has impacted your life.
Right. They're all doing that. I even saw, although it was brief, Columbia announced that you were going to have to send a video.
Yeah, I saw that.
To Columbia. And I mean, the obvious purpose of that is so we want to see what you look like, and then we can just surmise a demographic category. And the outcry, they dropped that requirement. For now, I wonder, a lot of things get dropped in outcries and then they quietly come back 6 months later. So you never know. But look, that's not new. California passed a ban on affirmative action on quotas preferences by referendum in 1996. And the University of California immediately started thinking of ways that it could get around it. Now, it was not entirely successful. You could tell that they had an effect because the demographic student profile at many of these campuses changed, which basically means that the Asian percentage went up, right? Mm-hmm. Because they were getting the most locked out. They're good at gaming the system, but I usually I'm the doomer, always giving you the bad news. Some of my friends this is meaningless. Even the Supreme Court ruling is meaningless. They'll find a way around it. Probably they'll find a way around it to an extent, but not wholly. If Prop 209 had no effect in California, the UC campuses wouldn't look the way they do now. And remember too that the Democrats put I was astonished by this. I never thought this would happen, but they put an initiative on the ballot to repeal 209, meaning let's go back to the old way where the state can practice preferences, quotas, etc. And it lost. The repeal lost in a state that's vastly more progressive and democratic today than it was in 1996. Now, I did not predict that happening, and it's also a much less white state than it was. There's been a lot of white flight, for lack of a better term, or just middle-class people moving out. So California, from immigration, in-migration, and out-migration, the demographic profile has changed. You would have thought, well, Prop 209 is dead, but hey, it survived, actually by a very healthy margin, I think by a bigger margin than it was originally implemented.
To pivot a little bit on your book, and one of the critiques in your book is when you look at the current ruling regime, it's neoliberal ideology that captured America and that we are now in a backlash against from the social democratic left and nationalist and populist right, nationalism, populism right. What would you say are the key differences between this neoliberalism of the late and post-Cold War period and some of the classically liberal elements of the founding? And how would you say has liberalism colored the way that we look at the founding and how conservatives think about the Reagan legacy?
Golly, I don't even know where I would start with that. I mean, I'll just take the last part. That's the easy one. Yeah, I think what's going on right now in conservatism, the rethink of Reagan is good. I wish we would be less acrimonious. Some people are going to chastise me, you are the one saying to be less acrimonious when you're always beating the hell out of people in print. Well, yeah, only when they really have it coming, I'd like to think. But look, I like Reagan. I love Reagan. Reagan was the president when I was in high school. He defined the 80s when I was a kid, and I have nothing against Reagan. I have a problem with slavish devotion to the Reagan agenda when it doesn't make sense for completely different times. In fact, I doubt if you had Reagan here today and you said, okay, it's 2023, look around. What do you see in the United States? Is your 1980 campaign platform what we need to do right now? He would say, no, it's obviously not what we need to do right now. Let's just take one issue, right? Reagan was not as much of a free trade absolutist as people remember. In general, he liked the idea of free trade. He was persuaded by remember, he was an economics major as an undergrad. He never got a degree beyond his college degree, but he always felt like he had a decent grasp of what the free market was supposed to do. And so was an instinctual free trader. But he also knew that other countries cheat, and that if you can't, it's foolish for your country, for the United States, to practice doctrinaire free trade when other countries in their dealings with you are not on the level and are violating free trade principles. And so Reagan actually negotiated and implemented a lot of tariffs. I think reluctantly. I didn't think he wanted to do that, but he tried to get these other countries to stop doing what they were doing. They wouldn't, and he said, okay, I have to retaliate. You've put me in a position where I have no choice. People, the free traders today, the Reagan conservatives who excoriate Trump and, let's say somebody like J.D. Vance, new face of the Republican Party, they forget all of that, right? And I think they mistake Reagan's military buildup and hawkishness, general hawkishness, and think, well, doesn't that mean we just have to intervene everywhere in the world? Wouldn't Reagan support intervention in Ukraine? Well, hard to say. I mean, maybe. Reagan was very proud of the fact that he was the president who, even though he was out of office by, 9 or 10 months when the Berlin Wall came down, that his presidency led directly to that. If you go to his library in Simi Valley, California, there are pieces of the wall. There are statues of him in Poland, in Hungary, in the countries that were liberated. They still revere. I've seen one of them in Budapest and one in Warsaw, actually. They still revere him over there. And he was proud of that. So maybe he would, I can't say what position he would take on Ukraine, but I can say that I don't think there's anything in the Reagan policy or in conservative orthodoxy that requires this heavy investment of American money and weapons and so on in this war in a way that conventional conservatives kind of thump the table and insist.
Something that when I was in college specifically, there was, I remember there was a bit more, not as much, I guess, I don't want to say skepticism, but I guess criticism, or there's less perhaps criticism of, the Reagan years, and I didn't live through them, my peers didn't live through them, but something that has been pointed out, I think more recently, perhaps in the last, several years, decade or so, is specifically his amnesty, his amnesty policies. And it sounds like that's received some criticism, especially. It
has. I mean, it's actually been criticized for a long time, but it's getting more mainstream. There were only a handful of people who really... Immigration is just... it really first burst onto the national scene as an issue in 1994 with Prop 187, which was an initiative that Pete Wilson, who when he was governor, he didn't put on the ballot, but he decided he was going to endorse and kind of make it his running mate. In a way, and it passed, overwhelmingly. I think I don't think it was 60. It might have been 60-40, but it was at least 55-45. No benefits for illegal immigrants. Of course, it was enjoined by a federal judge, never went into effect. And California has been demographically transformed by decades of unchecked illegal immigration that the state really is powerless to do anything about. Not that the state, in its more recent dispensations, would have wanted to do anything about it, but Wilson would have. Duke Majan. And so what happened in '86 is Reagan got a bill passed. He thought he had made a compromise. He thought he had made a deal with Republicans and Democrats to tighten up border security, tighten up internal enforcement at the workplace, make sure people were legally eligible to work in the United States, and so on and so forth, in exchange for an amnesty of people who are already there. Mm-hmm. And what happens is Congress went ahead and enacted the amnesty, and the business lobby and Democrats and others, just the usual suspects who like open borders, stymied the implementation of the rest, and it never happened. And the problem kept growing. And there were people at the time, mostly, I don't mean this as a criticism of them, I just saying that they were just mostly the people in DC very, very focused on immigration issues, who said, this is a bad deal, this is a disaster. It was supposed to be a grand bargain. They got their half, we didn't get our half. And most of the rest of the right just didn't pay attention to that throughout the 90s and throughout the 2000s. And especially when, you get, Bill Clinton was a bit more of an immigration skeptic, if you can believe it, than George W. Bush was. Bill Clinton appointed a former Texas congresswoman named Barbara Jordan to head up an independent, she was a Democrat, but it was a bipartisan commission, to head up a commission on what should we do about immigration, and that commission's result was, we need serious restriction. We need more border security, internal, we can't keep going the way we're going. And none of that was, of course, implemented either. George W. Bush, on the other hand, was a kind of full-throated cheerleader for mass immigration, and the more the better. And that coupled with the Iraq War, well, I think, started to really fuel the divisions within the Republican Party that were papered over by the fact that, of course, we nominated John McCain in 2008, who was all for the Iraq War and was all for as much mass immigration as possible. Mm-hmm. We nominated Mitt Romney in 2012, sort of barely, but who was all for the Iraq, I guess, but had a businessman's position on immigration, which is basically the more the better because we need the labor, but he kind of realized, this was back when, you have to imagine the Mitt Romney of 2012. He's very different than the Mitt Romney of 2023, who whatever the left-wing anti-Republican position is, he takes with gusto, just immediately. the Mitt Romney of 2012 realized, I think the base is getting a little restless about immigration, so maybe I better come out as a kind of immigration hawk. Okay, didn't help him. He did better against Obama than McCain did. I mean, it didn't help him win, let me put it that way. But that fault line in the party was there, and it was huge, and Trump found it and was able to exploit. Exploit is not a nice word, but you know what I mean. Some other candidate probably could have made this a national issue. And Pete Wilson, intended to make it a national issue in 1996. He ran for president, having won his re-election as governor of California, and immediately got a throat ailment. He literally wasn't able to speak for like 60 days. You can't campaign if you can't talk. Sure. And he also, look, to be honest, I worked for Pete Wilson, and I really admire Pete Wilson. The fact of the matter is the Republican Party then, more so now, but even then, was pretty overwhelmingly pro-life. And it was willing to nominate pro-choice figures in blue areas, like Christy Whitman as governor of New Jersey, Rudy Giuliani as mayor of New York, where a pro-life candidate had no hope at all. But it wasn't going to nominate a pro-choice candidate on a national ticket. It just wasn't going to. And I think even if Wilson had not had the speech problem, he would have not been the nominee just for that alone, probably.
So that actually raises an interesting point. What are your thoughts on, in a post-Roe America, on how things are going to, how the dust is going to settle in regards to where you see conservatives moving and shifting with that decision?
I don't know. I mean, what we've seen a little bit of movement so far. People saying, "I can't live in a state that doesn't allow X." They're fleeing the. Right now, most of the movement has been people leaving blue states to go to red states for the lower taxes, a better cost of living, less crime, more jobs, and so on. So, the big winners are Texas and Florida, and I guess Tennessee to an extent. And nobody's flooding into California and New York right now. I get with a handful of, I suppose immigrants are still coming to California to some extent. And if you want to make it big in the tech world, you have to go to Silicon Valley. But the net inflows are down. Actually, for the first time since California became a state in 1850. But what we're also seeing, I'm seeing little of this, and it's probably a lot of it's Twitter chatter, so I don't know how seriously I take it. I find it, honestly, kind of a hopeful sign where these, highly online blue people are like, oh, they passed this new law. Like, it won't even probably ever affect them personally, but I just can't live here anymore. I'm going to work. And I'm thinking like, got by, like, good, you should live where you're comfortable, and I'm gonna go live, I voted with my feet. I moved to Texas, so if libs find Texas not to their liking and want to leave, I wish them well. I think they just like I found myself, I moved for many reasons, but one of them was I just felt really out of place in a blue state. And I thought, I'm no Texan by any means. Like, I have no accent. I'm not very outdoorsy. I don't have boots. I don't have a hat. I don't have a horse, right? So I'm the fakest Texan in the world. But as soon as I got there, I already felt like, all right, I'm decompressing a little bit. It's just feels more my speed here. And if they feel the same way, they should do that. It will make national politics, unfortunately, a lot more acrimonious. I suppose you could argue that either way. Maybe it'll make it more. Maybe it will make it less. Maybe when we don't have to be in proximity and fight with one another. But, red states are going to get redder, at least for the time being. Blue states are probably going to get bluer. I don't know how you get much bluer than California, New York, Massachusetts already are, but.
Do you see cities like Austin, Texas, or perhaps, I haven't really tracked any influx of like liberals or, Democratic voting people into like cities like Dallas, but I remember last election, people who I don't take seriously were saying, oh, they might like vote blue this time. I'm like,
yeah. So no, people have been predicting Texas will go blue for a long time because of the Hispanic percentage, which is very large. So there's two, and that may happen. I don't know. It may happen. I will say though that the two guys, well, the one who talks about it the most, these two guys wrote a book in I think 2002, John Judas and Rui Teixeira, called "The Emerging Democratic Majority." I haven't really heard. Judas doesn't seem to have poked his head up and said anything, but Rui Teixeira is still out there, and he says, you know what, we may have gotten this wrong, or if we got, and his whole point was just demographics are going to produce a blue wave in the country, and he says we may have gotten this wrong, or at a minimum we might have been way early on our prediction. This may take longer than we thought. So a couple things that I think from the numbers that I've seen and that people show me going on in Texas, one is Hispanic voters in Texas are not as overwhelmingly liberal, progressive, democratic as they are in other states. In fact, when I was way back when I was in grad school in Claremont, there was a professor there named Peter Scarry. I think he decamped and he went to Boston. But Peter Scarry wrote a book called Mexican Americans, the Ambivalent Minority. This is sometime in the mid-90s. And that was part of his thesis, was like, they don't actually vote the same way everywhere you go. There are regional patterns that differ. You look at New Mexico, which has had the largest and old, not the largest, but by percentage, and also the oldest, literally going back to the 17th century, Mexican community. Like, they vote a certain way. You look at California, it's a certain way. You look at it's not the same everywhere. And so, for instance, a hopeful sign, not definitive, but a hopeful sign, right? There was a huge red shift in heavily Hispanic parts of the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, right, in 2020. The moment when people thought Texas was really on the cusp is the Beto mania of 2018, when they thought he's going to beat Ted Cruz. And he got close. I said the other day it was 5 points, and I was with the Publius Fellows, not your class, but the news class, and of course a kid whips out his phone and it was like, it's 3.8. It's like, okay, a little 3.9 or whatever it was. So it's even closer than 5, which is very close for a Texas election. However, then you get 2022, 4 years later, Abbott versus Beto, boom, blew it right out, right? It wasn't even close again. And I think that's driven in part also by the fact that numbers I have been shown is that the in-migration from Texas, is mostly, is at least overwhelmingly Republican, the same way to Florida. People worry about, I wrote an essay for an American conservative last year, or maybe it was 21, called Blue Locusts, about like when these Californians come and ruin your state, which Oregonians complaining about in the 70s, in the 80s. Idaho complains about now. But it seems like the ones coming right now in the last 2-3 years are not the blue locusts. Like it's red people getting out. So that's only strengthening in Texas and Florida, the Republican registration advantage. For now, I make no prediction for the next 20 or 30 years that this will hold forever. But for now, it looks like Texas kind of got a little close, and then it's growing out again, and maybe that'll hold for another couple of decades.
So for the,
I hope so, because I bought a house.
In Texas?
Yeah.
And so you left DC, right?
I left Virginia in DC area, which was never home.
Sure.
And my daughter had graduated from from high school, and we were kind of like, so it seemed like a good time.
So you end the book with a number of speculations of what pretends to come in the near future, and I'd love for you to maybe give us a summary of what are your predictions in light of where we are now.
I tend not to make predictions because I get embarrassed if I'm wrong.
Sure.
So I can't be,
Is there a vibe?
I have contempt for the TV pundits who are constantly making predictions that are always proved wrong within 48 hours and they never admit it. So I just lay out possibilities without making a prediction in that book. And where are we right now? I mean, well, let's see. I don't know when this will be released, but I can say that on the day we're taping it is the day after, or is it 2 days after Trump's third indictment? I forget if this came down yesterday or if it came down 2 nights ago. Anyway, very recent. So, and this never happened before. Former president's never been indicted once, much less twice, much less 3 times. Okay, at the federal level twice over 2 separate incidents, and there's still one state level thing pending in Georgia. It's hard to make predictions because we're in an unprecedented situation. I mean, the country has just never faced this before. Other countries have faced things like it, but a country as large as ours, that used to be as stable as ours, with a tradition of rule of law as strong as ours. So the easy prediction to make is that Trump will be the Republican nominee. It seems rather obvious. And I hope I did not upset any of my DeSantis supporting friends. I don't mean that as any attack or criticism of them for supporting DeSantis. I'm sure they all have great reasons. I'm just saying analytically, it looks like to me like Trump is going to be the nominee. And the harder the Biden administration goes after him, the more certain that becomes. And then I have a hard time seeing how he wins in 2024. And this upsets my Trumpy friends, or even people who are not friends, who think that I'm betraying him by saying that. I'm just saying, look, all the rigging, the pre-rigging that they did in 2020, changes in the rules, the mail-in ballots, the early voting, the ballot harvesting, the Zuckerbucks, the media censorship, the social media censorship, the foundation, the NGOs, the federal grants to get out the vote, all of that stuff is still in place. And Trump hasn't fought it. He he talks about it, but he hasn't fought it. He had the power, much more power to fight it in 2020 when he was president, and he didn't. And now he could just file lawsuits, but he's not doing that, I think, in part because he's got to the extent that he has the bandwidth and the money for lawyers, it's all on his own indictments. And so they have changed, the Democrats have fundamentally changed the system to make it really easy for them to win and really, really hard for us to win. And I just don't see a serious effort right now to overcome that. And so I don't expect to win in 2024. I feel bad for saying that. I hope I'm wrong for saying that. Caveat emptor to the listener, I said I didn't think he'd win in 2016. I just thought we should vote for him because we needed to, but I still assumed he wouldn't win, and he did, so I could be wrong.
Well, in closing, as we wrap up, what would you say, most of our audience, who I hope is listening, are young conservatives, what would you say is your advice to them for how we need to operate to save the country or think more about what comes after the Republic?
Yeah, my advice is going to be like unpleasant, right? Which is you're all young, ambitious people, and you want to go to Washington or New York or maybe the West Coast or somewhere where the big things are happening. I would say don't do that. There's not a lot you can do from there, especially not in national politics. I would go home, right? Wherever you're from, and strengthen your local community, your state, your city, your county, right? We're going to need powerful state Republican parties in the red states, strong parties that produce good candidates, that produce solid majorities in legislatures, good governors, good statewide office elected officials that pursue policies and that are ready for when the feds come and say, look, the hell with federalism, we're taking over, and have the juice to stand up to that. And it's just not as glamorous. It's easy for, I got to work in the White House twice, so I can imagine some 22-year-old going like, okay, so you got to work in the White House and live in Manhattan, but you're telling me to go back to, Boise or wherever. Like, easy for you to say, jerk. I get it, all right? I do, but unfortunately, I grew up when I grew up and things were different and I could do that. I also, I didn't see 2023 coming when I embarked on my career, whenever the hell it was in the early 90s. But we're in 2023 now, and so you can't pretend like it's the early 90s. You're gonna have to deal with the hand that you've been dealt, and it's not great. But then there's a lot of opportunity in it too.
Well, thanks so much again for joining us today, Michael. If people want to follow more of your work, is there anywhere that they can find you?
I am at the Claremont Review of Books almost every issue, and sometimes at the American Mind, sometimes just ad hoc where people want, if I get asked to write something and I think it's a good idea, I will write it. I am trying to shift to longer form projects, a couple of books, at least 3 in my head, maybe actually 4, I should say, and a movie that I'm not allowed to talk about because the producer gets mad at me and says, never ever give away anything about what's in the movie because somebody will steal the idea. So I'm not going to say what it's about. So I'm working on those, and so you may not see much out of me in the next couple of years. I hope you don't, because then that means my nose is to the grindstone and I'm actually producing what I want to produce.
So they can look at the CRB for most of your...
Yeah, I will have a review in the next CRB of Patrick Deneen's Regime Change. I talked to him about it here last night.
Great.
I told him I believe it is a friendly review. It is somewhat critical. I have disagreements with him that I had to be honest about, but it's definitely not intended to be a savage attack or dismissal. After that, I know what I'm doing for the CRB actually. So I did Deneen. My colleague Glenn Elmers wrote a little book that I'm going to review for the following CRB, and then one of my personal heroes, Harvey Mansfield, has a major book about Machiavelli coming out that I've already read in manuscript, and I'm going to review that for the CRB after that. So I got 3 book reviews coming out in a row, and other than that, I'm going to just try to be working on my projects. I may do a couple. I reread Machiavelli's Florentine Histories recently, and I had an idea for kind of 2 articles from that, one for academic journal, one more popular, but I haven't begun the writing. I just have reams and reams of notes.
Great. Well, we will include links to the stakes in the show notes for anyone who's interested. And thank you so much again, Michael, for joining us. And thank you, listener, for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select Modern Age articles, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we'll see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.